In our June bonus tutorial, we are painting a beautiful and complex watercolor bouquet made up of all the flowers that we've been working through on the channel lately. We're going to go slowly, step by step, so let's just get started. Hi patrons, welcome back. So this is quite a large scale project and we are going to go through it one step at a time, starting with supplies. So I have some scrap paper here. This is just a piece of cardstock. I also have some tracing paper and graphite transfer paper. We're going to go through the process of doing the drawing and then transferring it. I have a pencil and eraser. I'm using an artist pen, a fine liner. That's the Pigma Micron 05. I have some washi tape. I have various nylon round brushes from size 5 and 4 to some 0 and 1, paper for blotting, 2 glasses of clean water, and of course my koi watercolor set from Sakura. And then for watercolor paper, I'm using a hot press pad from Canson today, 140 pound. So let's talk about drawing this. I like to start with an axis. It's always just good to know where the middle of your drawing is, right? Often I do my sketches on graph paper, but if you're working on blank paper, why not lay down a line? Then when you're drawing the vase, which I'm doing here, you know where the center of it is, and you know for the entirety of the sketch. The vase is basically, I'm doing a square with rounded corners and then adding a little bit to the top here. Then as we begin to draw flowers, first I'm going to start with 2 lilacs. I want to have 2 so they sort of balance each other like mirror images, but of course not perfect mirror images. So we'll do 1 there. I'm just drawing the shape, a sort of drooping cone, and then that will help me to sketch in the flower afterwards. And of course, if you want more details about how to paint lilacs or how to draw them, you can check out some of the videos. I'm going to link all these videos in the description below. So I do have one about painting and one about drawing, and we're going to do an anemone in the center here. Of course, there's a video about how to draw them, so I'll link that as well. So we're sort of using all the flowers that we've been doing lately on the channel. I'm going to put that right in the center with some of its little scraggly leaves. This is obviously a very rough sketch. And then I want in the top corner here to do another anemone, but just a little smaller and on a bit of an angle. So you can see I kind of draw a bowl shape and then I fill in the petals, and that helps me because I create a guide essentially at the beginning of the sketch, and then I'm able to sort of fill in all the details. Now I want to add some smaller flowers. So in these 2 corners, I'm going to do, again, to balance the image, to balance the painting, I'll do buttercups sort of in the bottom right and the top left, and they're very tiny. And then right here at the top of the bouquet, I'm going to do some periwinkle. So I'm thinking about my color palette. I'm going to do this in a very yellows and purples, so contrasting or complementary colors. I think it's going to look quite pretty. So I wanted to have some purpley blue in here. And the periwinkles are nice because they're not as small as the buttercups, but they're not as large as the lilacs and anemones. So there is our very, very rough sketch. So what we'll do is we'll cover that with tracing paper and we'll go over it in pen. And if you're a fan of the channel, which you obviously are, you know that tracing paper helps you to refine your image, your illustration, because you can capture what you love about your drawing and change what you don't. So if one of those petals looks a little too big, you can make that change while keeping all the other petals that you really like the shape of. You can see when I go over the anemone here, I actually decided to do 5 petals, not 4. So I'm changing that, and I'm adding details like the petals are a little more jagged, and I'm making the stamen look more like what it will actually look like when I paint. Now, of course, you're going to be painting this, not drawing it, so how much detail you add at this stage is totally up to you. Some artists will choose not to add very much, like the lilac here. You can see it's not worth it to me to fill it in completely, but I do want to sort of figure out the shape and have it looking somewhat the way it will look when I paint, because then this will give me more confidence when I begin painting. I know what I want everything to look like. So you can see I'm just going over everything, adding those finer details, and just making sure that everything is sort of in the right spot and that the whole piece looks balanced. The tracing paper actually serves a dual purpose in that you are able to refine your sketch, your illustration, but it's also nice because it's part of the transferring process. So we really want to lift this illustration in order to transfer it onto the watercolor paper. So it's doing two things at once. It allows you to refine your drawing, and it's going to be part of our transferring process. So you can see all the flowers are drawn in, and I like the way they look. Everything does have a nice balance. There's a few big leaves, there's a few small flowers. You can see I might color in the leaves just to show me where is all that greenery within this piece, because a black and white image can be a bit much to look at. You're not sure what you're looking at sometimes, so color in those leaves if it helps. We're going to go around that jar. I always like to do 2 lines to show the glass, although that won't matter once we start painting. And then we're going to have a few stems here that you can see in the water. So and of course the glass, I'm going to paint it in brown, like a nice old brown jar, so that will be painted. So let's remove our initial sketch. Now we have our tracing paper sitting on top of our watercolor paper. Again, I'm using 140-pound hot press paper from Canson. I've taped the trace in place, and then I will place that dark side down, the transfer paper dark side down, and I'm going to take a nice sharp pencil and start tracing over everything. And how much you trace over is up to you. I will not trace over anything inside of the lilacs. I'll just do the outline. Here, we'll lift this up. I'm not going to make you watch me trace the entirety of the thing. It takes a minute. And you can see I've traced everything that I feel is necessary. So there's big blank spots where the lilacs will be painted in, but I can still see there, I have a bit of a guide. I know where they're meant to be. And for the little buttercups, I've basically just traced the stem and a little semicircle. So I know where those buttercups are going to sit, but I don't want any heavy lines in my painting. So what I'm going to paint first is the lilacs, and I am mixing up a nice purple, mixing in lots and lots of water on the palette here, and I'll actually create a purple that sort of, I've got some warm purple on one side and a cooler purple on the other side of that paint puddle, and that's going to be nice when I start painting. I can grab from either side of the paint, and that way I can easily achieve a nice variance of color within the lilac, within the flower. To paint the lilac itself, I'm doing some floral shapes like little 4 or 5 petal flowers, and I'm also just doing some dots. So this, because there's such a complex bouquet here, I don't want to get lost in too much detail. Now, of course, how much detail you want to create within your painting is totally up to you, but I don't want too much. So part of my lilac is just this wet, messy stippling almost. I'm just laying down dots of color to give the illusion of all these tiny little blossoms coming together to make the larger lilac flower. I'm going to use a lighter purple, a more watery purple along the top of the lilac shape to show that maybe the light is hitting it, or even light source aside, the lilac will have these beautiful variants of color, as I just said. So whether or not you're worrying about a light source within this piece, you just do want the difference in color. So this lilac is a little bit warm purple, a little bit cool purple, a little bit light purple, and a little bit dark purple. And you can see I've just made it a little darker and cooler on the underside where the lilac flower is drooping over. That's a little darker, and it's a little lighter along the top. And then I'm just adding a bit of detail to those tiny buds that are always at the tip of the flower. Let's talk a little about the leaf. I'm using a very saturated green paint here to paint in one side of this leaf shape. And then I'm going to wipe my brush, get a much more watery paint, almost no pigment in there, and I'm going to paint that in on the other side, making sure to touch the other side of the leaf that is more pigmented so it blends nicely. And I'll do something a little different for the other leaf here. I'm just using that very, very light watery green. I'm also mixing a little purple there so that we get a nice blend where the purple meets the green. So you can always do that if your paint's not wet. Add more paint if you want to see that beautiful seepage of color. And then I'll go in with that dark green and just add it to the bottom and the top of the leaf and let that saturated color seep out into that puddle wet area. And you can watch me painting in this second lilac here. I'm following that same formula where I'm just doing really a loose stippling, lots of dots close together with a little bit of the paper showing through to give the look of tiny blossoms all clustered together. I'm using that cool purple, I'm using the warm purple, I'm using a purple with a ton of water mixed in to make it really, really, really light. And then we'll do those dark buds right on the tip of the lilac, and a few of them can be a little bit abstracted, a little watery, and I think that looks great. It looks beautiful, and there's no mistaking it for a lilac. Also, one last thing to mention, you don't want the cone shape to be too perfect. It should be a little weird, a little wrong, because it is a flower. If it's a perfect triangular cone, it's gonna look strange. I'm painting in that third leaf the way I did the first, with the dark side and then the light side touching, and I think that looks really nice. And we'll add a little bit of darker color at the bottom and the top, just like we did for the second leaf. And now what I want to do is mix up a nice muted yellow color. So I'm mixing yellow with a little bit of brown and a little bit of white to get this more sophisticated yellow color, but it's still quite light. And I'm going to paint in those buttercups, and they're just a few brush strokes, really. 3 random little brush strokes together, or make a little V shape or a little heart shape. It really doesn't matter. And I'm just placing them wherever one would look good. I'm following the outlines that I laid down, but I'm also adding extras wherever I feel I need one. And I'm using a very warm muted green here to add some little stems and leaves, and allowing those stems and leaves to bleed into the yellow ever so slightly, so that it just looks really natural and free. You'll see here when you add the little stems, if you just touch the yellow color slightly and the yellow is not too wet, you'll get a nice effect, a nice little bit of bleeding color without it being completely out of your control. And I'm just adding this, I'm using the tiny number 1 round brush and just adding these little leaves. And then I'm mixing up a nice periwinkle blue. That's a blue with a little bit of purple in it, so that I can paint these periwinkle flowers. And I think that's going to add a nice bit of color to the piece. So this overall bouquet is going to be all purples and yellows with that little hint of a very periwinkle purpley blue. And for these flowers, I just want to create a little contrast by I'm painting in the 5 petals here, you can see, with a very light blue. And then I go back in and I just add a bit of darker blue on either the tips or at the center, and that will just help them to look a little more lively, and so that the color doesn't look flat or dead. And I'm doing this very, very loose, adding extra flowers or extra petals even where I think I might need one. So you can see there, it's pretty free. Then for the anemones, I want to do them in a very light purple. So I've mixed up a purple with a lot of water in it and just a hint of white paint in it as well. Some watercolor artists do not use white paint. I do. So that's just one of those things. You have to decide what's right for you, but I like mixing in white. And then I'm adding a little bit of just a hint darker purple on the petals that lay underneath those first 5 petals, so that it's just ever so slightly darker. And we'll actually wait for the paint to dry a bit more before we try to add too much contrasting color or darker color. I'm using a very small brush to add a very saturated black paint in little dots to create the stamen in the center. So stippling to make that center circle. Then we're doing this tiny ring of lines all fanning out like the hands of a clock. And then again, these tiny little dots around that ring of lines creates the beautiful and very intricate stamen of the anemone flower. And it doesn't have to look perfect. This one's a little weird, and that's a good thing. That is totally fine. For the second flower, because it's not open, sort of facing the viewer the way the first one is, we will do the stippling in the center the same way, but then you won't see the entirety of that ring of lines, right? Because that front petal is obscuring your view. So we'll just do a sort of 3/4 ring of lines and a 3/4 ring of dots. And there we go. Now I'm taking a very pea green, this is a green with a little bit of red mixed in to mute it, and I am making these scraggly leaves that the anemone flower has. And I just sort of go quickly, and I do with just the tip, with lots of paint on a very fine pointed round brush. I just do this stippling, and I sort of just shake the brush a little bit to give the look of these scraggly, jagged leaves. I haven't sped this footage up very much, so this is really how I'm moving, and you can see I just sort of go along freely and try to just add little dots of paint, creating the shape of the overall leaf. I'll use that same brush with its nice fine point to add some lines to these lilac leaves, and then I'm taking a bit of clean water and just kind of obscuring them a little or blending them out a little so they don't look too harsh. So lines first, then a bit of water to bleed them out. And now I'm at the point where I'm just adding little details, a little darker yellow here to just add a bit of contrast to those buttercups. A little bit of purple around the center of the anemone just shows that the flower is going in slightly at its center, and it might be just slightly darker there, or the petals underneath might be in just a touch more shadow. And some of this I'm just making up, so I just felt that the periwinkle needed a little more detail, so I decided to add these lines to the petals. So there we go, the flowers are all done, and now I need to do the vase. This was a little scary for me. I mixed up a very light chocolatey brown, and you can see I'm mixing water in right as I work on the page. And then I was like, I need a bigger brush, so this is a number 6 round brush, and I've mixed a little purple into the brown here, so it's not quite all the same shade of brown. You can see as I move, I'm leaving spaces white. I want there to be these tiny random areas of highlight. So there's just a few little dots of highlight along the bottom of the vase. There's a line of highlight along the left-hand side, and then there's going to be a huge blown out highlight area here on the right. So whenever we're painting, I always talk about using one light source, but truly most things are going to be lit from different areas, from a couple of windows plus a lamp. So it makes sense to have a couple highlight areas. One will always be larger, and that's what you see me doing here. I'm moving very quick so that the paint doesn't get, so that the brown color can bleed out into the wet area without it looking stiff. So I want to work fast, and I'm just adding a darker brown around the edges of the vase, around the top where all the flowers are sitting. I want that to be a little darker. And of course, you don't have to get it completely in one go. You can add more pigment for shading, more brown, once it has dried. Do wet on dry, but I wanted to achieve a lot of the glass look by doing wet on into wet, because I think it will look more natural. Here you can see I'm adding a darker brown with a finer brush up in the top of the vase near the flowers. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's a little messy. And I'm adding a little bit of purple sort of on top of the rim of the vase here so that it looks like the lilac is peeking out slightly, and that purple will blend really nicely into that brown as well. So that's a good thing. And then you're actually going to see me add a bit of purple here to the brown of the vase. I mean, purple works nicely as a low light for brown, but in this case, it could also be that the lilac is actually being reflected in the glass a little. So it works in 2 ways. And now this was the part that really scared me. I am taking a very fine brush while the vase is still wet, and I'm using just the tip of that number 4 round brush to drag it through the wet area in the center, and I am making these broken lines that are meant to look like the stems that you can just see the silhouette of through the darkened brown glass. And some of them I've just dragged the belly of the brush there slightly to make it larger. Some of the lines are broken. Yeah, I love the way this turned out. I was just very scared to do it. But it does look really cool, and I think it looks natural, and if you can do those lines while that area is still wet a little bit in the center, it's going to look great. And then you can see me coming back in here and adding a little bit of darker brown to the 2 sides of the vase, and also to the bottom of the vase, as if we can see through to the bottom there. just did a couple horizontal lines and then bled them out. And then I added just some random little green lines and whatnot to the bouquet to make it look lively and real. And that is it. That is the bouquet of flowers using all of these flowers that we've been drawing and painting on the channel. For more information on lilacs and anemones, check the video description for all the video links. Thank you so much, patrons. I will see you soon over on the YouTube channel with a new tutorial.